Summary and Analysis Chapter 25 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. The Duke and King, pretending to be Harvey and William Wilkes, are received by Peter Wilkes's family, including his niece Mary Jane, whom Huck thinks is very beautiful. When the Duke and King approach Peter's coffin, all the people gathered go quiet, and the two con men begin to cry their eyes out, and everyone else starts to cry too. The Duke and King work the crowd, and Huck finds the situation disgusting. The King addresses the crowd, saying how hard it was to lose Peter, and how grateful he is to those gathered. Someone begins to play music, and the King resumes, inviting close friends of the family to supper that night. As the Duke makes signs with his hands and goo-goos like a baby, the King goes to the townspeople, and addresses mostly all of them by name, and informs them about what Peter had written to him. Mary Jane fetches the letter her uncle left behind, and the King reads it and cries. In the letter, Peter Wilkes bequeaths to his nieces his house and $3,000 in gold, and, to his brothers, $3,000 in gold. The letter also says where the gold is hidden. The Duke and King, along with Huck, go to the cellar and find the hidden bag full of gold, and, even though anybody else would be satisfied with the mere sight of that much gold, the Duke and King count it. They discover that there's about $400 worth of gold missing. The two agree to make up the deficit with their own money so that, when counting the sum before the townspeople to prove that everything is being done fairly, no one will question what happened to the missing gold. The Duke and King also agree to give their part of the treasure to Wilkes's nieces so that no one will even suspect them of fraud. Upstairs before the townspeople, the Duke and King announce that they are giving what Peter seemingly bequeathed them to his nieces, because otherwise the two would feel as though they were robbing the girls. The Wilkes girls hug the two con men, thinking the two their very loving uncles. The King goes on to invite all the townspeople to Peter's funeral obsequies, which he mistakenly refers to as orgies until the Duke discreetly corrects him. The King explains he uses orgies instead of obsequies because that is the word used in England, based on Greek and Hebrew etymology. A man, Dr. Robinson, laughs in the King's face after he gives his etymology of orgies. The townspeople are shocked, but the undeterred doctor goes on to accuse the King of being a fraud. The townspeople tell him he's wrong, and the Wilkes girls cling to the King and begin to cry. But Dr. Robinson tells the girls that, as their father's friend, he begs them to get the King out of their house. Mary Jane responds by giving the King Peter's $6,000 to invest on her and her sister's behalf. Dr. Robinson tells the girls that they will regret this day, and takes his leave.
Analysis. Huck seems especially disgusted by this scene because the Duke and King are not exploiting the badness of society, as they did with their royal nonsuch con, but rather its goodness, the love of people for other people. This is an important lesson for Huck in determining how to act well and live a good life. One of the Duke and King's strategies to protect their cover is to ingratiate themselves with society, to make people like them so that, if their integrity comes into question, people trust their own emotional responses rather than the facts. The con men do so by inviting people to dinner, for example, and personally addressing them, in general by making people feel special. The Duke and King scam appears to have a significant payoff, lots of gold, which in turn promises to free the Duke and King from financial worries. The King's tears may seem false, but could they also be tears of vulgar joy? The Duke and King express their greed in several ways here, from counting the money to counterintuitively agreeing to give their part of the treasure to the Wilkes girls. Of course, they do so to further ingratiate themselves with society, and to gain more with that trust than they would be able to do otherwise. The Duke and King manage to make seemingly good deeds serve selfish, wicked ends. The Duke and King's ploy to earn the trust of society works with devastating efficacy, demonstrating again just how skillful the con men are at exploiting the folly of society. When the King almost blows his cover by referring to obsequies as orgies, with dark wit he covers his error by exploiting the language of worldly learning, which he rightly assumes to be over his audience's head. Dr. Robinson stands apart from society in his learnedness and shrewd evaluation of other people. These qualities allow him to expose the King, but they also lend him a condescending air that is shocking and abrasive. Even though the doctor is right in this case, he is not as good as earning people's trust as the King, and so he fails to help people see the error of their ways. He would better be able to serve the greater good were he more empathetic.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 26 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. The Duke and King and Huck are all given rooms in the Wilkes home to sleep in. Later that night, the Duke and King host a supper for a group of townspeople. The Wilkes girls say that they have cooked poorly, but Huck thinks the food is fine, and that the girls are just fishing for compliments. One of the Wilkes girls, Joanna, whom Huck calls the hare-lip, because she is afflicted with that condition, asks Huck about England. Huck lies, but the hare-lip catches him in a contradiction, which Huck just barely wriggles out of with yet more lies. Huck resumes, but gets caught in another inconsistency, which he again wriggles out of, only to be caught in yet a third contradiction, all because he is forgetting his earlier lies. Joanna accuses Huck of telling her lies. Huck denies the accusation, swearing on a dictionary that he has told nothing but the truth. Joanna says she believes some of what he says but not all. Just then, Mary Jane approaches and tells Joanna that she shouldn't talk to Huck in that way, because he is a stranger far from his native country. Huck feels bad, because Mary Jane is so good in defending him, and yet he is letting the Duke and King steal her and her sister's money. Huck decides to return the money to the girls. Huck searches the King's room for the money, but doesn't find it. Just then the Duke and King enter the room. Huck hides behind a curtain and overhears the two con men debate whether they should stick around to sell the Wilkes home or leave right away to avoid detection. Huck thinks he wouldn't have felt bad about this an hour or two ago, but that now he does. The King convinces the Duke to stick around and sell the house, because doing so wouldn't harm the Wilkes girls. As they leave the room, the Duke tells the King that they should hide the money in another place, because otherwise some slave who comes upstairs to pack up Mary Jane's belongings might find the gold and steal some of it. Almost discovering Huck, the King takes the money from behind the curtain and hides it in a straw mattress. After the Duke and King leave, Huck takes the money, planning to hide it outside. Huck slips, gold in hand, down the ladder leading from his room to the rest of the house.
Analysis. The girls fishing for compliments is a very minor kind of fraudulence, where they say one thing while thinking another in order to exploit those around them. The Duke and King are different from most people not in kind but degree. Huck has been caught in lies before, but never as frequently as this. Why he is lying to protect the Duke and King is strange in the first place, though, given how disgusted Huck is with the two con men. It could be that Huck contradicts himself so much here, because his more mature and guilty subconscious is trying to expose the truth. Mary Jane conforms too much to societal convention for her own good. When she should trust her sister's intuitions, she trusts Huck blindly because he is a stranger far from home. But Mary Jane, as Huck sees, is also deeply good. Because she is a human victim to Huck, and not just an abstract victim of the Duke and King's scam, Huck maturely resolves to help her. Huck reflects on how he has morally matured in just 2 hours, whereas before putting a human face to the Duke and King's victims he would have gone along with their scam. Now he feels compelled to expose the Duke and King's wrongdoing. Note also how the King's tyrannical greed, seemingly boundless, prevents him and the Duke from escaping with the money now, a costly mistake. The Duke and King expose their racism when they suppose that a black person might try to steal the money, when they themselves are stealing the money. It must be said though that, while the Duke and King are racists, they do not seem to be making a moral judgment against black people here, but rather are just concerned with the practical matter of keeping the money to themselves.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 27 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Huck tries to take the money outside. He makes it as far as the parlor, where Peter Wilkes's corpse lies in its coffin and sleeping men sit around, before he hears footsteps coming toward him. Huck quickly hides the money in the open coffin, and then hides himself behind a door. The footsteps are those of Mary Jane, who comes into the parlor, stands before her uncle's coffin, and quietly mourns. Huck creeps back up to his room, and night turns to day. In the afternoon, Peter Wilkes's funeral is held. Mourners walk past Wilkes's coffin, looking down, some crying. Huck notices how often people blow their noses, how soft and gliding and stealthy the Undertaker is, and he concludes that Peter Wilkes was the only one that had a good thing. As the preacher is speaking, a dog begins to bark. The Undertaker goes out reassuringly, hits the dog till it's silent, and comes back in. The townspeople appreciate the Undertaker's actions. He's a very popular man in town. After the king got off some of his usual rubbish by giving another speech, the Undertaker seals the coffin. Huck can't be sure whether the bag of gold is still in there, or if somebody took it out, and he's worried that Mary Jane and her sisters might never get it back. The king says he and the Duke must be leaving for England, and tells the Wilkes girls that they're welcome to come. The two con men, meanwhile, are in the process of selling all of the Wilkes estate, house and slaves and all. They plan to keep the money from the sale, then leave the unlucky buyer to discover once they are gone that the purchase is null and void because it was sold by men who had no right to sell it. Huck's heart aches to see the girls get fooled like this, but can't think of a way to safely expose the Duke and King. In selling the Wilkes' family of slaves, the king separates a mother from her children. The Wilkes girls are distraught at this, and if Huck hadn't known that the sale was of no account, and that the family of slaves would soon be reunited, he figures he would have had to tell on the Duke and King. Later, the Duke and King also question Huck about whether he's been in their room. Huck lies and says that he hasn't, but that he did see some black slaves go in there several times. The Duke and King are upset to learn this, thinking the slaves stole the bag of money hidden in the mattress, but the two also know they can't do anything because the slaves have already been sold. The Duke and King yell at each other and, as they walk off, Huck is glad to have made it seem like the slaves stole the money without bringing harm to them.
Analysis. This scene, maybe more than any other, exemplifies Huck's indifference to social norms and his commitment to fluid, practical solutions. His act of hiding the money in the coffin is a minor desecration, a fact revealed all the more starkly by Mary Jane's respectful, loving mourning. That doesn't diminish, however, the goodness of the act. Huck, with his love of life, is disturbed by how mawkishly miserable the mourners are, and also by the Undertaker, who is cruel to a harmless dog, and whose cruelty is bizarrely appreciated. Mourning seems a mere societal convention to Huck, who is free from sentimentality, thinking as he does that Peter is better off than the living in this case, because he is free from self-imposed miseries. After ingratiating himself even more with the townspeople by exploiting their mawkish sadness, the king along with the Duke prepares to complete the scam. Huck aches to see the girls, who are so good, get hurt, but he is not an idealist who would expose the con men without having figured out the logistics first. Huck has morally matured, but his sense of the practical is a constant in his decision-making. In one of his cruelest, most selfish acts, the king separates a black family for profit, just as Jim was separated from his family. The Wilkes girls are nobly distraught, just as Huck is, who has matured into recognizing that black people are just people with feelings like everyone else. It is hard to say whether Huck's lie reveals Huck's own racism, that blacks are predisposed to wrongdoing, or whether it merely exploits the Duke and King's own racist assumptions. Such a question does not concern Huck, however, who is just happy to have pragmatically protected his identity as the thief and to have done so without hurting anybody else. Huck cares about consequences, not means.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 28 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Huck comes upon Mary Jane, who is packing for her trip to England. She is also crying because, in selling the Wilkes' slaves, the Duke and King separated a mother from her children. Moved by her tears, Huck blurts out that the family will be reunited in 2 weeks, and, thinking that in this case the truth is better than a lie, he says he can prove it. Huck reveals that the Duke and King are not Mary Jane's uncles, but rather a couple of frauds. Mary Jane indignantly wants to have the Duke and King tarred and feathered. Huck says he would tell on the Duke, and King immediately accepts that he would be endangering someone, Jim, and he proposes a different plan. Huck tells Mary Jane to go away, because he is afraid that she will express in her face knowledge of the Duke and King's fraud, which will in turn allow the two to escape. Mary Jane is to return in the evening, after Huck and Jim have made their escape, and expose the Duke and King, sending for the townspeople of Bricksville, the sight of the performance of the royal nonsuch, as witnesses regarding the Duke and the King's trickery. Huck also gives Mary Jane a note explaining where he has hidden her bag of gold. Mary Jane promises to remember Huck forever and pray for him, and, though Huck says he has not seen Mary Jane since, he thinks of her often. After Mary Jane lights out, Huck runs into her sisters. Huck lies that Mary Jane has gone to visit a sick person in town, and, though the girls press Huck on the facts of his story, he at last tricks the two into not mentioning anything to the Duke and King that might alert them to Mary Jane's knowledge of their fraudulence. Later that day, the Duke and King hold an auction to sell off the Wilkes estate. As the auction draws to a close, a steamboat lands, and a noisy crowd approaches, singing out that in their company are none other than two men who claim to be Harvey and William Wilkes.
Analysis. It is maybe because Huck recognizes just how big Mary Jane's heart is here. She is crying out of an empathy with the slaves that he decides to trust her with the truth, as he trusts only Jim. Huck's trust in Mary Jane makes telling the truth practical. Huck has grown up enough at this point that he discourages Mary Jane from immediate action, which would be efficient and practical, in favor of a course of action that is maybe less efficient but more sensitive to Jim's condition and needs. Mary Jane has a strong sense of justice, one that in its earnestness and self-consistency strongly contrasts with that of society at large, but it is precisely the strength of her feeling that makes her a liability in exposing the Duke and King. Unlike Huck, she does not have the freedom of character that would enable her to dissemble or act, as Huck does, and so she would give the Duke and King a chance to escape. Huck may decline to tell Mary Jane's sisters the truth because he doesn't trust them sufficiently, or maybe because it is more practical for only one sister to know the truth, so that there are fewer people who could tip the Duke and King off, even accidentally, that their cover has been blown. The Duke and King are astonishingly able to get away with auctioning off the Wilkes estate, despite the suspicion Dr. Robinson cast on them. The townspeople are so taken by the con men that they only test their assumptions when directly contradicted.
Summary and Analysis. Chapter 29 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Despite the arrival of the two men who claim to be Harvey and William Wilkes, the Duke and King persist in their fraudulence. After the King cracks a joke at the real Harvey's expense, most of the townspeople present laugh, but there are few who don't. One of these is Dr. Robinson, another is a lawyer named Levi Bell, who calls the King a liar. Dr. Robinson suggests that the two sets of men claiming to be Harvey and William be affronted with each other at a tavern, so that their real identities can be determined. At the tavern, Dr. Robinson asks the King to produce the bag of gold so that it can be kept safely till the townspeople determine who is who. The King says that the Wilkes slaves stole the gold, but nobody really believes him. The King then tells his story, followed by the old man claiming to be Harvey Wilkes, and Huck thinks it's obvious that the King's is a liar and the old man a truth-teller. Huck, in giving his story, is interrupted by the doctor, who tells him that it is clear he is a bad liar and shouldn't strain himself. Levi Bell begins to speak with the King, and eventually tricks him, the Duke, and the other old man claiming to be Harvey Wilkes to write something down. Bell then produces from his pocket a letter from Harvey, to find that none of the handwriting given him matches that of the letters. The old man explains that his brother William copies his letter, and Levi concedes that his plan to expose the frauds has succeeded only partially. He knows that the Duke and King are frauds, but he is unsure about the other two men. The real Harvey Wilkes asks the King to reveal what is tattooed onto Peter Wilkes's chest. Whitening, the King at last says that it is a pale, blue arrow. The old man says that that's false, that his tattoo is really of the letters PBW, but the men who buried Peter Wilkes say they saw no such mark. The townspeople become convinced that all four men claiming to be Peter's brothers are frauds and, enraged, decide to dig up Peter's body to see if he has any tattoo at all. After disinterring Peter's corpse, the townspeople discover the bag of gold that Huck hid in Peter's coffin. The man who is holding Huck by the arm to prevent him from running away lets go of the boy to get a look at the bag, and Huck immediately makes a run for it. He meets Jim by the river, and the two begin to drift away. Suddenly, though, Huck hears a familiar sound, the humming of a skiff. It is the Duke and King. Huck sinks to the floor of the raft and almost cries that the two con men are not yet out of his and Jim's lives.
Analysis. At last, when the townspeople's affection-based trust in the Duke and King is called into question by the arrival of the real Harvey and William, the people society wouldn't listen to earlier, people of reason like Dr. Robinson and Levi Bell, are given the attention that their arguments merit. The townspeople are forced into rationality the hard way. It is ironic that when the king tells what he believes to be the truth about where the gold is, the townspeople don't believe him, but that when he tells what he knows to be a lie, which Huck himself thinks very transparent, the townspeople less readily gainsay him, suggesting how easily mislead society is in its search for the truth. Also, Huck has been a rather proficient liar till now. It seems his strain to lie is due to moral qualms or having to lie about something regarding which he has no knowledge. The Duke meets his match in Levi Bell, who tricks the veteran trickster into exposing his own lies. It is strange, though, that the townspeople don't act on the results of Mr. Bell's test. Whereas it would be reasonable at this point to jail the Duke and King, the townspeople seem not to have followed Mr. Bell's logic at all, and allow the Duke and King a chance to escape later. Society does not act logically. The King's guess as to Peter Wilkes's tattoo is so audacious, may be what saves him and the Duke from immediate incarceration. Again, it is ironic that the townspeople don't believe the real Harvey Wilkes, and they are so irrationally flammable as to denounce even him as a fraud. Their search for truth is farcical at best. Even though Huck is helping the Wilkeses expose the Duke and King, he is wise enough to know that the townspeople are stupidly unpredictable, so, instead of taking his chances with the mob, he makes a bold bid for freedom. But that freedom is limited by the arrival of the Duke and King, whose self-interestedness has come to metaphorically imprison Huck and Jim in a life of fraud and close scrapes.